The first swing sounded like someone splitting firewood. The second one sounded personal. And by the third swing, my mailbox was lying in pieces across my driveway, while my neighbor stood there with a baseball bat like he was doing community service instead of committing vandalism. The crazy part wasn't that he broke it. It was that when he noticed my security camera pointing straight at him, he didn't even bother to leave. He leaned on the bat, took a sip from a travel mug, looked directly toward my front porch, and actually smiled. I've lived in Maple Ridge Estates for almost 11 years, and if there's one thing I've learned about quiet suburban neighborhoods, it's that they're only quiet until someone decides they're in charge. In our case, that someone was Leonard Briggs, a retired construction supervisor who lived 3 houses down with his wife, his spotless black pickup truck, and an ego that somehow took up more space than both of them combined. Every neighborhood has a guy who thinks he knows the rules better than the people who wrote them, and Leonard had spent years turning that personality trait into a full-time hobby. He wasn't on the HOA board, he wasn't elected to anything, and nobody had ever asked for his opinion, yet somehow everyone got it anyway. If your garbage can stay outside 20 extra minutes after pickup day, Leonard noticed. If your grass grew half an inch taller than everyone else's, Leonard noticed. If your Christmas lights stayed up until January 10th instead of January 1st, Leonard somehow treated it like a federal emergency. Most people rolled their eyes and ignored him because arguing with Leonard was like trying to convince a rooster the sun wasn't coming up. He enjoyed the fight more than the outcome. I was one of those people until the mailbox. Looking back now, I probably should have realized this wasn't about a mailbox at all. It started weeks earlier when I received a handwritten note taped to my front door that read, "Neighborhood standards exist for a reason. Please adjust your mailbox before someone reports it." No signature, but it might as well have had Leonard's face printed across the bottom. The funny thing was that I had just replaced the old mailbox after a delivery truck clipped it during a snowstorm the previous winter, and because I didn't trust anyone's opinion except measurements, I had downloaded the HOA guidelines myself. I measured everything twice, then had my teenage nephew help me measure again because he thought I was being ridiculous, but I wanted proof. Height, distance from the curb, post width, everything matched the guidelines almost perfectly. I even snapped photos with a measuring tape visible because something told me this wouldn't be the last conversation about it. My wife, Claire, laughed when she saw me documenting a mailbox like it was evidence in a murder case. She said, "You're preparing for a trial that doesn't exist." I shrugged and told her, "Maybe. But if there's one thing I know about people who think they're always right, eventually they'll need someone else to prove they're wrong." She kissed my forehead and went inside, probably assuming I was overthinking another harmless neighborhood annoyance. I wish she had been right. 2 days later, another note appeared in our mailbox this time, folded neatly, informing me that the post looked visually disruptive and suggested I lower it before the HOA became involved. Again, no signature. Again, no actual rule cited. That afternoon, I happened to see Leonard watering flowers that didn't need watering, mostly because he spent more time watching traffic than gardening. I walked over and asked politely, "You wouldn't happen to know who's leaving anonymous notes around here, would you?" He didn't even look embarrassed. He smiled and said, "Some people care about property values more than others." Then he gave me that little chuckle people use when they're trying to sound wiser than they are. I almost argued, but something stopped me. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was experience. Maybe it was the realization that some people survive entirely on the attention you give them. So I nodded, wished him a good afternoon, and walked away. Behind me, I heard him mutter, "You'll thank me eventually." That sentence stayed in my head for days because there was something unsettling about it, like hearing thunder when the sky is perfectly blue. Then came that Tuesday morning, just after 6. I was still wearing an old college sweatshirt and pajama pants when the notification from my driveway camera buzzed on my phone. At first, I thought it was another deer wandering through the yard, but instead, I saw Leonard climbing out of his truck carrying a baseball bat. For one strange second, my sleepy brain tried to invent innocent explanations. Maybe kids had left sports equipment in his yard. Maybe he was taking it somewhere. Maybe this was some misunderstanding. Then he walked straight toward my mailbox, adjusted his grip, and swung. The crack echoed across the street before I even made it to the front door. Then came another swing, and another, until splinters scattered across the driveway like somebody had dumped a box of kindling onto the concrete. By the time I stepped onto the porch, Leonard had already finished his little performance. He rested the bat against his shoulder, lifted his coffee cup, and looked at me with the kind of satisfaction you usually only see on someone who thinks they just won an argument nobody else knew they were having. "Morning, Ethan," he called out as casually as if we were discussing the weather. I stared at the pile of broken wood and bent metal where my mailbox had stood for years and asked, "What exactly are you doing?" He shrugged. "Fixing a problem. Your mailbox was too high." He genuinely believed he had authority over another man's property. Claire had followed me outside by then, wrapping her robe tighter against the cool morning air. She whispered, "Did he really just admit that?" I nodded without taking my eyes off him. Leonard pointed the bat toward the broken post and added, "You can thank me later. Better this than getting fined." Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away at exactly the same speed he always drove, as if smashing someone else's property before breakfast was just another item on his daily schedule. Claire looked at me, waiting for the explosion she assumed was coming. She had seen me frustrated before, but never angry. Instead, I took out my phone, saved the camera footage to 3 different folders, emailed a copy to myself, and quietly said, "I'm going inside." She frowned. "That's it. For now." Sometimes the loudest revenge begins with silence. About an hour later, I was sitting across from Officer Delgado at the local police station explaining what happened while the security footage played on his monitor. He watched Leonard swing the bat twice, paused the video, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Well, that certainly removes any questions about intent." He asked if there had been previous disputes. I handed him copies of the anonymous notes and the measurements I'd taken weeks earlier. He looked at me for a second and smiled. "You measure your mailbox often?" I laughed for the first time that morning. Only after a man starts acting like he's running for mayor of the curb. He chuckled, took the paperwork, and filed the report. Walking back to my truck, I still didn't feel angry. Mostly I felt disappointed. I grew up believing adults eventually outgrow playground behavior. But neighborhoods have a funny way of proving that retirement simply gives some people more free time to create drama. On the drive home, I passed the post office and remembered something the officer had mentioned. Since the mailbox had been destroyed, I needed to notify postal services so deliveries could be handled properly. It sounded routine, almost boring, which is probably why I went in without expecting anything remarkable. The clerk behind the counter was a woman named Denise who had worked there so long she greeted half the customers by first name. She listened patiently while I explained the situation, typed a few things into her computer, and said, "We'll place a temporary hold until your receptacle is replaced." I thanked her and turned to leave when she added almost as an afterthought, "By the way, because your damaged box is part of the neighborhood cluster route, there may be some delays affecting nearby addresses until everything is cleared." I stopped walking. "What do you mean by nearby?" She clicked another screen and pointed toward a map. "This section of your street shares processing through the same assigned route. If access or verification becomes an issue, packages are often held for pickup. Standard procedure." She wasn't smiling or suggesting anything clever. She was simply explaining policy. I nodded politely, thanked her again, and drove home thinking about that map the entire way. Claire met me in the kitchen. "What happened?" she asked. I poured coffee, sat at the table, and explained everything. When I mentioned the cluster route, she stared at me for several seconds before saying, "You're thinking what I think you're thinking." I answered honestly, "I'm not thinking about revenge. I'm thinking about consequences. There's a difference." She smiled because after 23 years of marriage, she knew exactly what that sentence meant. 2 days later, the consequences began. Our neighbor Melissa walked across the street carrying her phone. "Hey, Ethan, have you had any trouble with Amazon deliveries?" I shrugged. "Not personally." "What?" "Mine says delayed for pickup." Before I could answer, another neighbor joined us, saying his prescription shipment had been held. By that afternoon, people were comparing tracking numbers in little groups at the ends of driveways. Nobody seemed angry yet, just confused. Leonard, meanwhile, walked around like a man expecting applause. I watched him stop beside a couple discussing their missing packages. He folded his arms and announced, "Probably the Postal Service cutting corners again. Government efficiency." I almost admired the confidence required to blame everyone except the person swinging the bat on security footage. The next morning, a large Chewy delivery failed to arrive for the Henderson family, whose elderly golden retriever depended on prescription food. Their daughter drove 14 miles to the distribution center to retrieve it herself. Later that afternoon, Mr. Patel from the corner house discovered his wife's medical supplies were waiting there too. The story spread faster than any official notice ever could. Soon everyone was asking the same question. What happened? Leonard still didn't know. 3 days after the incident, I received an email from the HOA requesting documentation related to the property damage. Apparently, another resident had mentioned the situation during a committee meeting. I uploaded the photographs, the measurements, and finally the security footage. Before hitting send, I watched the video one more time. Leonard never looked nervous. He never hesitated. He looked proud. That confidence would become the biggest mistake of his life. 48 hours later, the HOA president, a retired school principal named Barbara Collins, called me personally. She skipped the small talk. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I've served on this board for 8 years, and I have never seen a resident justify destroying another resident's property by pretending to enforce community standards." I stayed quiet while she continued. "For the record, your mailbox complies with every applicable guideline. In fact, your documentation is more organized than ours." I couldn't help laughing. She didn't. "We're opening disciplinary proceedings immediately." That evening, Leonard stood outside his garage chatting with another neighbor when a certified envelope arrived. The delivery driver handed it to him, waited for a signature, and drove away. Leonard opened the letter right there on the sidewalk. Even from my porch, I could see the expression on his face change from confidence to confusion, then confusion to disbelief. He looked around as though searching for someone to explain what he was reading. The next morning, another certified letter arrived. Then another agency contacted him. Then another. By the end of the week, the man who spent years policing everyone else's behavior suddenly found himself answering questions from organizations that actually had authority. And for the first time since I'd known him, he stopped offering advice to the neighborhood because he had become the neighborhood's favorite topic of conversation. For the next couple of weeks, our little neighborhood felt like the world's politest mystery novel. People still waved when they drove by, kids still rode their bikes in circles after dinner, lawns still got mowed on Saturdays, but every conversation somehow drifted back to missing packages, delayed deliveries, and the growing pile of questions nobody could answer except the man who had started the entire chain of events with a baseball bat. I never had to knock on Leonard's door, never had to raise my voice, and never once posted anything on social media. The evidence spoke for itself, and once institutions start talking to each other, pride becomes a very expensive hobby. About a week after Barbara called me, I received a copy of the HOA's official decision. The language was formal, almost cold, but one sentence stood out. No resident is authorized to alter, remove, damage, or destroy another homeowner's property under the pretense of community enforcement. They imposed daily fines until restitution was completed, suspended his volunteer committee privileges, and required reimbursement for the damaged mailbox and installation costs. Claire read the letter twice before looking at me and saying, "You know what the funniest part is?" I asked what she meant. She smiled and replied, "He wanted control, and now he doesn't even control his own week." She wasn't wrong. Around the same time, the postal inspector contacted me to confirm details about the incident. The conversation was professional and surprisingly brief because there wasn't much left to investigate. The video showed everything clearly. Dates matched, statements matched, and photographs matched. I realized then that truth has a quiet confidence of its own. It doesn't need dramatic speeches when facts are standing in the room. Meanwhile, neighbors started returning from the distribution center with stories of long drives and unexpected inconveniences. Melissa joked that she spent more time retrieving one package than she spent ordering it. Mr. Patel laughed that his grandkids would probably inherit his online shopping account before his next delivery arrived. Even through the humor, there was frustration, and eventually people began tracing that frustration back to the morning everyone had ignored except my driveway camera. Then came the HOA meeting. I attended because I had been invited, but I sat in the back and kept my comments short. Leonard spoke for nearly 15 minutes. At first, he insisted he had acted in the community's best interest. Then he argued that he believed the mailbox violated standards. Finally, when those explanations fell apart against measurements, photographs, and video, he claimed he was simply trying to encourage compliance. Barbara let him finish before placing my documentation on the table. The room became so quiet that even someone shuffling papers sounded loud. She adjusted her glasses and said, "Mr. Holloway, Communities function because neighbors respect boundaries. Rules are not permission slips for personal retaliation. Then she paused and delivered the sentence people would repeat for months afterward. You have mistaken confidence for authority, and those are not the same thing. Nobody applauded. Somehow silence carried more weight. Over the following weeks, a brand new mailbox stood where the old one had been, installed at the exact same measured height as before. I couldn't help smiling when I checked it with a tape measure one last time, not because I needed proof anymore, but because life has a strange sense of humor. Leonard stopped walking around the neighborhood giving unsolicited advice. His truck was still spotless, but it stayed parked more often than not. For months later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, a moving truck pulled into his driveway. Claire looked out the kitchen window and asked softly, "Are they leaving?" I nodded. We stood there with coffee mugs in our hands while furniture disappeared into the truck one piece at a time. Across the street, curtains moved ever so slightly as neighbors pretended not to watch. Nobody celebrated. Nobody cheered. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with cardboard boxes and a forwarding address. As the truck pulled away, Leonard glanced down the street for a brief second. I don't know what he was thinking, and honestly, I stopped trying to figure him out a long time ago. What I do know is that I never touched his property, never insulted his family, and never tried to embarrass him. I simply trusted the process and allowed his own decisions to create consequences bigger than anything I could have planned myself. Looking back, people still ask me why I stayed so calm that morning when he destroyed my mailbox. The truth is simple. Anger usually wants an audience, but patience prefers results. And sometimes the most satisfying response isn't getting even with someone. It's watching them discover that the rules they tried to weaponize apply to them too. So now I want to ask you this. If you had walked outside and found your neighbor smashing your property while smiling into your security camera, at what point would you have stopped being polite? Would you have confronted him immediately, or would you have done exactly what I did and let the consequences unfold on their own? Share your opinion in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where you think justice ends and revenge begins. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation because stories like this remind us that sometimes the loudest victory is the one you never have to shout about.